Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another. We have to find a name to call these things, right? Because we have cheeky chats, we have cheeky Fridays, but welcome to
Cheeky
another
fabulous.
cheeky fabulous with myself, Letla, and I'm with my favorite girl.
Hey, welcome everybody. We're so excited for today's conversation. I also need to find a new thing to say because I always say I'm excited for the conversation, but it's because I genuinely am. And when the conversation unfolds, you'll realize why. But we have the pleasure, and the Tlokonolo will introduce our guest, but we have the author of, can you see this? A Native Boy, Confessions of a Maplazini in the City by Thabo Molefe. Welcome to the Cheeky Natives, Thabo.
Thank you, guys.
So, I think tonight's conversation is really interesting because I think it sits alongside what books Thabo mentioned in the introduction of the book. So, one of the books is called Kafka Boy, which is the true story of a Black young coming of age in apartheid South Africa, Mark Matabana. And then the other one is a book that we also have had the privilege of being in conversation with the author, which is Born in Chains by Clinton Chauke, who wrote about, being born as a born free and how being born free is not really born free. And so today we have the pleasure of having a conversation with Thabo A. Molefe. Thabo A. Molefe is an independent consultant and business improvement professional with a deep affinity for South African history, art, and culture. His business improvement and change management work spans more than a decade in local government, oil and gas, logistics, mining, and financial service sector in South Africa. He holds degrees in business and technology from UNISA, WITS, and Pretoria universities. His professional certificates include the Lean Six Sigma Black Belt issued by BMGI USA and Deutsche Post DLH Germany. Thabo is also founder and principal consultant at Vintage Artifact, a consultancy service and natural stone processor design and manufacturing company. This is his first book. Welcome to the Cheeky Natives, Thabo.
Thank you for welcoming me with such an esteem, and it sounds like I'm this important guy. Perhaps I should be soon, when I'm grown up.
So I wanted to start the conversation. In the introduction, you start the introduction with a quote, and the quote reads, "We have failed to properly address the trauma and humiliation associated with the apartheid past, brushing it under the carpet of reconciliation instead, and we have diluted ourselves. The pain has we have diluted ourselves. The pain has gone away." Claudia Browdy, who wrote this in 2012, Spear, Smear, Tears of the Nation, Trauma and Competing Rights in Post-Apartheid South Africa, Helen Suzman Foundation. Now, I must confess, Thabo, when I entered the book and that is the quote that I read, I was like, oh my gosh, it's going to be a ride. Like, it's going to be one of those books where every chapter I'm going to have to take a break because it's going to be heavy. It's going to be like intense, right?
Yes.
But I want to say that I was surprised that it wasn't as heavy as I thought, although it did cover very heavy topics. And I wanted to know, as a start, the tone of the book. When you wrote the book, what was sort of the tone that you were going for? Because these are quite like intense topics about race, about racism, about growing up Black in sort of apartheid and transitioning into democracy.
Look, I think what I was thinking of when I was writing it, it was probably not the intention that it would be, as you say, like the subject matter would be heavy, but the event I talk about in the introduction is probably a heavy one. I mean, we'll all agree that having been free now for the last 25 years, as we say, I encountered something in 2017 that kind of reminded me that not much is actually changed, right? I actually remembered when that incident occurred in 2017 that my father had kind of told me a couple of stories that kind of introduced the idea of job reservation, right, in South Africa. And the fact that he had, probably for the entirety of his life, he couldn't do what he wanted to do. He couldn't be an artisan. He couldn't obviously buy things where he might have wanted to buy them. So as a child, I remember him telling me that he couldn't make certain toys that he once made. But he said, I can't make them now because my place of employment, they could really, really do things to me if they found out that I actually use the equipment to make these toys for you and your friends. So in 2017, I actually encountered something that is really an equivalent of that, where I'm in a job, but you're not really fully in the job in the sense that that job is traditionally seen to be a job reserved for certain racial groups, white males specifically. And you think, listen, this is 30 odd years later, but this thing is still there. So that first part, I think, is heavy. And perhaps, yes, as you are saying, Sokonolo, when you read further, perhaps up until the age of 24, it's a mixed bag now. There's some heavy stuff, there's some light stuff, probably some things you could say are actually an indication that South Africa has indeed evolved. And it was even evolving during the late 80s and into the 90s as well.
I think it's interesting that you've spoken about evolution, right? Because you start the book with an experience of racism, and the book ends with an experience of racism. And I thought that was so interesting that there was this distillation of South Africa at different points, but racism is a common theme. And when I think of the renewed conversations that people are having around Black Lives Matter, around diversity and inclusion in the workplace, I think that now that you've written the book and you see how the book started and ended, I'm curious about what your personal reflections on the nature of racism and how it's taken different forms has been, right? And what do you now feel looking back on these two incidents that start and end the book?
Yeah, I actually explained it, I think, somewhere in the introduction itself, that very, how I experienced this transition, whether it's a full-blown or it's a crazy or mixed bag kind of transition. I say in the introduction that I see racism in South Africa and obviously across the world as well as almost a shadow, right? It's you've seen when the weather changes or as the day flows from morning to evening, your shadow actually shifts positions, right? At certain times of the day, it's highly pronounced. It's very much maybe in front of you. It's very long. At others, it's very short. And maybe it's behind you, so you can't see it. But it's always there, right? So for me, that's really how I see racism in South Africa. It's a bit of a shadow. And there are certain incidents that kind of often remind us, either they're happening personally to us or it's these full-blown things on TV, maybe an incident of a guy at a restaurant that gets highly publicized. But obviously, it just shows that racism is always there, but it simply shifts and disappears, but appears to disappear, but it's always there.
So another thing that I found really interesting about the book is that I think the one woman you speak mostly about in the book is your mom, right? And it seems she has such a soft spot in your life and in your heart. And I want to speak a little bit about your mom, right? But I suppose juxtaposed to that is to think about like why there isn't stories about Rory Sang, for instance, or even about your sister. Was that an intentional move on your part?
It wasn't as intentional, but I think stories about Rory Sang, the girlfriend at that time, perhaps don't come through as strongly because the relationship was still very new, even though I remember it now as if it was yesterday. But she was younger than me, as you can imagine. So perhaps she wasn't shaping me as much as I perceive my mother to have shaped me. I mean, I am a bit of I wouldn't say mama's boy, but I actually recognize that even my father couldn't have done for me what my mother has. I mean, my mother was, you can see in some of these chapters around schooling and stuff, that actually I could probably have not gone further than I have were it not for her. And I mean, she wasn't educated herself, but she was someone who understood that if there's one thing she could do for me to change for me what could not change in her own life, it would be support around areas of school and that kind of thing. So she was really a central figure in my life.
I love that we are speaking about your mother, because for me, as a Black woman, there's an incident that stands out, and for me, I think it's the juxtaposition between all of these toxicities in our family. So there's an incident where your uncle participates in your mother almost being dispossessed of her home. And there are so many things to be read from that. There are things to be read about the ways in which Black women particularly are vulnerable after the death of their spouses, but also just the ways in which patriarchy and toxic masculinity often render women vulnerable and almost powerless. And I want to think about that incident and how it then shaped your relationship with your uncle, and in retrospect, so in reflection, now that you've written the book, what your relationship with your uncle is now.
Yeah, my relationship with my uncle was non-existent for quite a time. I think up until his death, and obviously that's very, very sad and maybe to a degree painful. But I think you're right about the how women are treated in general. I mean, I mentioned in the book that when my father got married to my mother, obviously my father only had brothers, right? So there would be instances when his younger brothers didn't have a place to stay. And he was adamant that he didn't want them around, right? I think at that time, with the situation of apartheid as well, you could actually, terrible things could happen if you are with your brothers and they get involved in certain unsavory, call it crime at that time. So my father wouldn't want them around, but it would be my mother actually who would talk to my father to say, don't be so hard on these guys. We need them around. So it's very ironic that upon my father's passing, it was one of these very guys who now, you see what I'm saying, turned against my mom and felt it necessary to not only dispossess her, but us as well. I mean, would not have been staying in that house had he succeeded. So I think for me, that says something about, look, I have my own ideas about the equality of the sexes and stuff, but I do think often there is something in us as males that closes us off to what makes us. And in many instances, it is actually women, right? Because they are the ones whose love, in many instances, creates the adult that you will be. In many instances, is shaped by how your mother treated you. In many instances, if you receive love, care from her, you're able to maybe pass it on and find it in your heart to do the same. So, and fathers do great work as well, but I suppose it's not the same. So for me, I'm really thinking that I think you do know this, guys, that in South Africa we do have that thing, that anti-woman kind of philosophy. Even in our own sort of African cultures, there is that element of dispossessing women, broadly speaking.
I mean, I think it's really interesting that you also speak about the death of your father. Am and I were having this conversation around the idea of like unprocessed grief. And I feel like a lot of what happens to you at the age that your dad passed away is this idea of unprocessed grief. So you kind of just have to move on and go ahead. And so many of us like don't have moments to sit and mourn and grieve. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that unprocessed grief and what that has meant for you in your life upon reflection, because it just seemed like you needed to get things done. I needed to finish matric. I needed to, get myself to university or work towards that. There's so many things that you needed to do. So to speak about like how that unprocessed grief maybe even shows up in your life right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I think, look, broadly speaking, that probably is an accurate kind of assessment of that situation. Because as we say, like I say, a mother is soft, but that strength and kind of toughness of a father is actually very important as well. And I think at that time, probably around the ages of like 15, 16, when he passed, I was obviously becoming a man just then, right? I had my brother, obviously. So I think I could agree with that his passing obviously brought about even this event with the dispossession of the mother and stuff by the uncle, or the attempted dispossession, actually made me perhaps not stop and say, hey, my dad is gone, blah, blah, blah. Actually, I had to almost step into his shoes to a degree. And I think there's a chapter where I talk about how my father's passing affected my brother. Because in a way, his passing meant that he's the next sort of head honcho for the family, right? He's now the Molefe and the head of the family. And I think for him even, he couldn't handle it. I think the chapter I call The Road Not Taken, where I talk about how he sort of approached his youth, his teenagehood and early adulthood. It could also be attributable to that kind of thing, that he didn't want to wear that little crown or that little gown that my father obviously had worn. He didn't want to face that responsibility. And perhaps because I was last in that line, in that lineage, it fell on me. And perhaps you're right in that regard in your analysis about this idea of unprocessed or grief and so on.
I want to talk about failing forward. I think that, we often read, and I think that with Black excellence and Black girl magic and Black boy magic, there is a celebration of success, but there's almost a frowning upon on failure. And in this book, you illustrate quite clearly, the areas especially in academics, where you had not done well or where you failed, right? So I think of your matric exams and how you did and etc. So we don't want to give away too much of the book because we still want people to read the book. But I think that there's a thing about failing forward in the book that for me is really interesting. And so I'm interested in your reflections around failure, right? Around our relationship with failure and how that's then shaped some of your life philosophies.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate there about that failing forward sort of idea, because I think you will agree that especially in this area of academics or academic success, it is not highly encouraged. In other words, if you fail, let's say fail matric, for example, it is often seen as though that's it. It doesn't matter whether you have a learning difficulty or there's something that can still be corrected or salvaged from the situation. Often in our background, in my background at least, humble servants, right? You've got to go get a job. And then further on, if you think now beyond matric, as much as academics and university degrees and Black excellence, as you called it, is something to aspire to, but often when you get close to it, even when you grasp it, when you do reach that goal, we were just discussing it with Nolo. It does not always say that it will be celebrated in a sort of unmitigated way. As I was saying to him, it polarizes actually, and you may actually find that it's only in not a minority, but definitely not a majority, where you get that kind of sort of encouragement. So failing forward, perhaps to answer you in this way, it's something that needs to grow more, I think, in our culture, in our society as Africans. Because there's a story about Jack Ma and the other jobs he has had before becoming a billionaire. I mean, you laugh when you hear that he failed at so many other things, right? He failed at teaching. He failed at even similar, jobs like selling potatoes and stuff, right? But now he's a billionaire. So can you imagine whether it's something in the Chinese culture that perhaps allows a person to constantly try and to get sort of encouragement to try, right? Whereas perhaps in other cultures, I'm not being anti myself here, but I can say that we do need to expand a bit on the idea of failing forward, because everyone who succeeds, it's basically probably an example of having corrected those mistakes and then getting it right ultimately. Yeah.
But I think also thinking about failing forward, what I think the book also allows, and I think perhaps even you sharing your life with us in this form of this memoir, is this idea of also institutional failure, right? There's a lot of institutional failure that happens, just around the structure of spatial apartheid, but even of accessing higher education, and how that in many instances is also not a failure that is attributable to you, right? It's that there are certain spaces in the world that were not created for people who look like us. And I think we also need to acknowledge that as much as the failing forward is you showing perseverance and tenacity, there was also this idea that like you were pushing against a wall that wasn't there for you to push. There was some resistance from the system that allowed you, because look, you could have been very far right now, not to say that you aren't, but because of the places you've been in, spatial apartheid, growing up in a farm and then moving on to a township, those sort of things also are kind of what created where you are today and the trajectory of your life.
100%.
But also, Thabo, sorry, before you answer that part, but also to say, and this is something that came out for me in the book, also to say that in many ways we recognize that failing forward is not a privilege or a luxury that a lot of average Black South Africans have, right? And there are very few people who, for example, whose lives would be set up in the way that they can be to attend an internship that isn't paying as much as like another job would pay, or to do distance learning, because they work the kind of jobs that take out time because of traveling, right? Apartheid spatial architecture means that you're on the road for such a large part of your day. And so I think that also in the faith, and this is something that the book emphasizes so clearly, to speak to the Tlokonolo's institutional things, is to also say that many of us don't have the luxury to fail just because of the ways in which structural inequalities have been set up.
100%. Remember, by the time I was about to turn 24 and starting the honors, 24, 25, right? The guys I was doing the honors with were much younger than me, right? And there was no other Black guy in that honors class at Wits in 2004. The guys are Jewish. They are talking about what they are going to do in the year after the honors. They're talking about these Jewish guys. I'm going to spend a year in Israel, in a kibbutz. This other one is saying he's going to join the IDF and maybe for the Israeli Defense Force for 2 years. This other one is talking about him and his girlfriend traveling through South America for a year. Gap years, right? That's what they're talking about. For me, I mean, I'm traveling from Ratanda, which is Heidelberg, about 70 Ks each day to go to Wits. And actually, one of the guys in my class, a guy called Joel Strauss, when I tell him that I come 70 kilometers away, right? From 70 kilometers away, he actually says it. He says, "You're mad, Thabo. You are actually mad. I wouldn't do that." Obviously, he's from Bryanston. So those infrastructural things, I think they have deep-rooted and far-reaching, I think, implications for Black life. There's a park in the area where I live now. There's a park adjacent to an area where former ANC President Or Tambo is buried, right? They tried to do a park around his that place, because it's a place of natural beauty. There's a lake, there's everything. But one of my guys mentioned to me that that idea is not going to work. In other words, it's a recreational area. And obviously, I disagreed with him. I said, look, it's going to work. He said, no. The people who wake up, who have time to wake up in the morning for a jog in that park and those types of things, are not the people in the immediate surrounding of that area. So you can see, in effect, what you and Shonolo are saying, that if you're black, you're not middle class, you're working class, you'll probably spend the greater part of your time traveling to work or traveling back home. So where's that time for? So that apartheid spatial planning aspect, I think, still wreaks a lot of havoc in modern black life today.
I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Piet van Aert, right? Because Dr. van Aert is this example of white benevolence, and in many ways is a good man in ways that, you know, we can't conceptualize of certain people. But there's a contrast between the benevolence that he shows you and the ways in which certain members of his family behave, which closely mirrors how some of the other people in the community behave. And so for me, I want to know how you've reflected on this benevolence that Dr. van Aert showed with the continued racism and the microaggressions that you experienced literally just in your immediate vicinity.
And I think just before that is also to think about often this benevolence, like these, and you say this in the book, right? You say these were, the first white people that were sort of with your family's time, and you were ready to go meet them, and then you met them. And I suppose a little part of you and that of your dad was like, okay, there are some like good white people in the world that like can do stuff. You know, these people are so kind. They will do this. But as Amma says, in your immediate area, when you and your father go to do a shop, you get the most abhorrent treatment from other white people. So how does this sort of white benevolence, right, and these microaggression exist next to each other?
And I think they do, but they're obviously not equally powerful if you want to compare them. They're not exactly equal forces. Because as I say, Mr. Van Aert is a guy from the Netherlands, right? Okay, he's come here, he's a South African now, but there's almost an element of him being from the outside, in a way. He's not like the normal Afrikaner who has been in South Africa for at least a generation, let's put it that way. So perhaps that gives him sort of a global view of how to approach his domestic worker and the family of that domestic worker. And another thing, again, that makes these forces not equally balanced is that town of Heidelberg is obviously the birthplace of the AWB, right? I think the AWB was founded around the same year my brother got born in 1973, around maybe about 15 kilometers from the hood. So whilst, yes, as you say, that he's good, I think actually, and I hope I'm not making too fine a point of this, but it's possible that his wife think you are leveling too much the playing fields here, or something like that. You could make me, in this particular instance, think that he's equal to either his white counterpart, right? So I think that continues even today. The progressive white people, I don't know how you're going to take this, but there's even writing that suggests that the progressive whites ought to change how they help, in a way, right? Because in a way, I mean, you know, in South Africa, there's this expression of kafferboetie. I don't know if you've heard of the expression, but in the States, it's called nigger lover, right? Other whites always see that guy as a bit of an exception, right? Someone to be put back into line, right? And often, if you get a person like that, you create. It's almost like you throw a stone in the pond, right? And the reverberations are never going to be what he wants them to be. In other words, the good guy, so to speak. I'll just end there on that one.
Well, when I miss Van Artene, I just want to have 2 or 3 moments with her. Because that lady, she was just like there, but like not there.
Nah, actually, I have I'm conversational with Dr. Piet van Art now that he's Dr. Piet. Back then, he was obviously like 5 years younger.
Yeah.
He actually explained to me, I hope if he hears this, he will not find that I'm misquoting him. That incident spoken of in the book where Piet utters those sort of unpleasant words, he says, actually, he acknowledges that indeed is the kind of thing that would happen, because the mother was pretty much almost an opposite of the father in how he viewed relationships, including interracial relationships, whether it's the romantic types or just the work types. This was the case between my mother and them. Yeah. So it's I think that's that. You maybe you will get a chance because she's still around. You might get a chance to utter a couple of words to her.
So there are 2 incidences in the book that like one of my blood.
Hi.
Like it boils. I'll start with the less intense one and then we can go to the intense one.
Okay.
So okay, degree, BCom informatics, you are ready, and it feels like the ancestors, Mudimu, everything is coming together. And here is this ad that you get, right? And we're excited, right? Because, oh my gosh, this is my opportunity. I'm going to get to do work and stuff like that. Then you have an encounter with this lady. Who? Wait again, I was ready to fight.
I'm talking about Shubikazi and stuff.
Yes, Jordan.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, so to just expand on that a little bit, I think that, in the book, we can be infuriated and very easily infuriated by the violence that white people inflict on you in the book, right? So we see it because this is outside of us and these are others, and it almost feels expected. But I think what Letokonolo is alluding to is the kind of violence exerted upon us by people who look like us, who want to improve our lives, but choose not to because of some sort of internalized self-hate. I mean, I want to know what you now make of that, right? Because Letokonolo and I were absolutely blown away that here was this woman of color who was in a position to really improve your life in some way, and she just didn't behave any better than what we would have expected a Mr. Van Rensburg to do in that particular situation. And I think that's what is so infuriating.
Look, that thing is quite common, I would say. Colloquially, that there's the saying that degrees are for, or qualifications are for blacks. Because if I mean blacks, I know we are a majority in South Africa, but from where I work now, even where I consult now, there are highly qualified blacks. Masters, economics, statistics, like the sciences, right? But you will find that a white person who's not as qualified is in the position, right? So in the way some of the people I know talk, they actually say that it's called sabotage. You know what I'm saying? Because in order for you to get through the door, the only thing, because you don't have these social networks of people owning companies and blah, 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 the only way for the door to even be slightly ajar is for you to get the papers, right? Go to school, get a degree. But when you then get into the door, this is what you actually find. And I think Shubikazi was pretty much doing the same. I mean, I realize it even today that when I was doing that degree, there was a time when maybe I'm left with 7 or 8 modules that I could have applied and still gotten work, right? But I wanted to finish it. But that thinking actually for me comes from the fact that I know that the fact that I'm left with 6 modules would have presented a challenge of its own, right? The door would have probably slammed shut. So it just shows you the layers of obstacles that I think a Black person does face. And often, as you say, some of that pain is wielded by someone, because I mean, I'm not saying, but at that time, that degree that I had with the marks that I had there was probably on the top of echelons of the country, right? But still, she didn't find it in herself to say that job is there, because that's the advert I responded to. But now you're sending me in that direction where I was doing clerical stuff. I did clerical stuff for about 6 months before jumping off that treadmill and going to do an honors degree.
I have to say that I could literally feel your exasperation in the text of the book, where you're saying you were sitting there at Stanlab and you're like, but what is this? What is this? Like, I'm just putting in.
I mean, essentially, I'm capturing data. I'm clicking print to print certain statements. That's basically what I'm doing with a degree, right? With a degree. So maybe, one gets we are able to close the lid to our own little exasperations. But it's not justice exactly, that kind of thing where you have the thing required, but no, there's something missing, and the thing that's missing is obviously you're not exactly of the right color.
And now the second point, and I think I will the second point, the second incident, like your.
Which one is this now? Is it Mr. Cohen's one, or is it some?
No, so it's the incident where there were the police sent to your house.
Yes, of course.
Ntlokololo and I had an extended conversation about this, because we felt like this was the manifestation of so many problematic things. Like, it was the intersection of everything, right? So it was the idea that the police themselves can be used as instruments of state-sanctioned violence, and not violence in the physical sense, but there's an emotional violence. There is a type of violence that I think that our police often exerts on Black people. So you see it in the way that they navigate in relation to how they move with us, as opposed to how they would treat white people. So it's the intersection of that kind of state-sanctioned abuse, but also the idea that there are people who know you in your community who would not hesitate to orchestrate that kind of thing against you, when we know the kind of tenuous relationship that Black people have with the police. So that raid could have gone a number of ways. It could have ended very badly for you. There was the threats of violence. There were so many things, but also like reputational things. Now there are police at your house on a random day and you're being accused of certain things. And the Tlhogonolo and I actually had a conversation about, like, are Black people okay? Like, are we okay? See, rights, like, do you know what I mean? And not okay.
And honestly, that's
in psychology, are we okay?
Like Arisharp, man. Like Arisharp. Like, here is a man who's trying to do better for himself and is trying to study and better himself. And Rona Black people were like, you know what? And what we're going to do is we're going to call 16 police officers. 16. Isn't 1, isn't 2, 16 because someone is selling drugs? No.
Because he thinks he's better, because you think you are better than us. Like, that was the undertone.
Another thing, actually, maybe we are taking it at the national level. How often have you seen, because I think that there's that sort of micro experience of it, right, with me, but if you take it at a macro level, you know that there has been allegations, right, in this political sphere, that certain segments of the major political party, the governing party, are actually using law enforcement agencies to discredit or to get out of the way certain individuals, right? So you can kind of see how I don't know, I don't want to say too much, but even good things, right? The idea of justice, right, gets perverted, right? When these emotional and maybe jealousy things come into play, right? So I think that is actually what was happening there, because that's just one incident. There are other incidents where you're fighting. That one seems relatively mild in comparison, but hopefully it's not happening anymore. But I don't think I cannot hope. You have 5 books or 15 books on a shelf. I mean, at that time, I'm 20. So all of those books are prescribed books. Maybe I'm in second year, so first year books are on the wall, right? But you will fight with people over, you think that those, actually, the uncle that I told you about in the book was one of the first guys to actually go crazy, saying that you think that, I think there's something happening, or there's something that has happened with the denial of even education for Africans, right? That's like when you do get it, maybe other Africans don't necessarily respond as they should. And then maybe these sort of incidents, then, okay. So yeah, it wasn't a pleasant one. That
I think that, it's interesting that you've spoken about education and the ways in which, I guess, education continues to be out of reach for a number of Black South Africans, right? And I think about a comment that you make, and there's a character in the book, Mlungisi, and you don't speak too approvingly of Mlungisi, because Mlungisi is also problematic, but Mlungisi also espouses in many ways what is wrong with the systems that we have in place. So Mlungisi has a learning disability and almost just gets written off, right? Because he has this learning disability.
Amma, before you go, I want to say my favorite part of Mlungisi is when they're writing the exam and then he stands up. He takes his paper, he throws it in the bin, and he leaves the classroom. I'm like, you know what, Mlungisi, just for that legendary.
But in many ways, he espouses the system, right? Because here's this Black child who has a learning disability, who may not have received the support that he needed to do, but who also needs to become successful because he lives in this capitalist society that requires certain things of him. And I think that there are feelings that you have about the kind of character that Mlungisi is, because he also has political connections, and in many ways those open the doors. So yes, he's shut out by the system in one way, but in other ways he has proximity to power, and he's got connections, and that then opens the door. And so I guess I'm curious, for you to speak a little bit to that, because Mlungisi is what's wrong with us, but he's also the product of a system that really means that if you are Black and poor and have learning disabilities, you are unlikely to succeed in the traditional educational system that we do have.
Right. I think I might actually just let it end there, because I think you've said it all. But my own perceptions about Mlungisi, actually, as you say, he represents a lot of what is wrong with us. Maybe this is just my view, but I'm sure that I do have fellow common thinkers when it comes to this. There is I think in our culture, this idea of meritocracy doesn't feature very well. You might have picked up that I'm comparing Mlungisi to a certain individual, a certain well-known individual, who then became a very sort of well-known leader in one of the prominent institutions in our country. But he, in many respects, I mean, if you listen, he's actually a social media kind of star now, because there are many memes with him speaking about how even when he was at the Zondo Commission, the things he said were openly showing that he's not he ought not to have been leading that organization, right? But because of politics and proximity to political power, as you say, he got there. So for me, actually, I think it's one layer to this thing of, if you're an average black person, how many obstacles are there against you, including obstacles put up by maybe your own people as well? Because it's not only the capitalist system that puts up those obstacles. In many instances, in some instances, it's actually us as well.
You know, the one person that I have many feelings about is Vincent.
Indeed.
And hey, Vincent, man.
Before you
Vincent.
go far, totally. I think he didn't have a good time, Limachita, in this book. Okay, I just think Machita now like how Machita didn't show up well in this book, like at all. They just were not well.
Perhaps, I don't know. Maybe it's a reflection of the kind of Machita that surrounded me, right?
Yeah, but Vincent and Vincent. Like, when we think about the number of incidences that have happened, right? I think particularly about when you began working together at APSA and how things were going well for you and things weren't necessarily going well for him, or things were just actually going okay for him, you know?
Yes, indeed.
And how
nothing wrong. There was nothing that detracted from his progress. In fact, yes. Continue here, Honor. Yeah.
And what really made me angry or mad, right, was Mutwana Sarubuisi, right? Just because you were doing better than him at work, like literally, you traveled from APSA back to Ratanda together, and there was a time where Kotek seeing he was looking for you, and then he saw you, and you know, in my mind, he probably closed that door in your face because he was just like, "Tsamaya, man," you know. And so I want to talk about that, right? I want to talk about, like, you know, people who we grow up with and people who we think have our best interests at heart. And when things start shaping up and things start taking a different turn for us than for them, these people sort of, I want to say, show their true colors and then continue to act in trashy ways.
Look, I don't want to throw things back to you too much, but I'm sure that everyone has a Vincent in their lives. I mean, someone who, for example, for me, Vincent was someone, you know, most, at least in my generation. I mention it in the book because there's a guy called Malika I talk about who was much older when we were in primary school, but he was in the same class as us. So even Victor was a guy who was like 3-4 years older than me, right? But we were in the same grade together. And to be honest, I had come to see him. I have an older brother, but I had come to see him as a second one, right? Because I think you need one. But I think Tupac and others, and even Jay-Z, talk about this sort of thing where best friends become enemies, but only when new things come into the environment. In other words, if there's this idea or this sort of notion of equality, in other words, it's me and him, we are all working at APSA, he's a bank teller, an inquiry clerk, so am I, right? But if things come into the environment that kind of begins to add now, the qualify the environment, maybe in addition to being this, I'm also that. I also do this, or I also go there, but I'm in the same job as him. I think that is where the challenges actually come in, because I think if we what apartheid did was it became almost like death, right? Death is said to be the leveler, right? It means it does not spare any of us. It gets us all in the end. So I think apartheid did something similar to death to Africans in that it equalized Africans, right? It made us be uniform. right? So I think some of our sort of battles and the character that Victor takes comes from that. From if we've been similar for so long, and then we grow into our various differences now as we grow as men and young women and so on. How do we handle that? Maybe I could ask now on her side as a female, because it's there as well, right? You're all girls, but you're going to have quite different experiences with men, and there may be some women who appear to be getting all that there is good from men, and others are getting the leftovers. So, right? So I think that is it. If we are being kind to actually to Victor, he most likely couldn't bear the idea that this guy is going to be different, continue to be different from me, but in good ways or in admirable ways, you know. And that really put the friendship at risk, I think, in the end. So he is worthy of disdain and being dismissed and disliked, but you kind of do understand him to a degree.
I think, though, that for me, in many ways, I think that it's a superficial understanding to just look at it as, yeah, black people are jealous, you know, like black people just have jealousy problems. When in actual fact, I think that a lot of that kind of behavior is a reflection of lack, right? So it's the idea that you feel that there is so little, there's so little opportunity, there's so little abundance that if I share with Thabo, it means that there's less for me. And ultimately, because I know what lack is, I don't want to lack, right? So I think that also in analyzing that situation, I also thought about how in many ways Vincent was just a reflection of what happens when people find themselves in continuous situations of lack, but also when people are not exposed to the idea that Thabo doing well doesn't detract from you doing well. So there's space for both Thabo and I on the table, because often there isn't space for both Thabo and I on the table. There's space for one black person at a time. You know, that is the quota that of blackness that people can handle. So I think that for me, in reflection, I was like, oh, Vincent is trashy. But I also understand that some of that trashiness is also related to what it means to be in a constant state of lack, but also to feel that you are in situations where there is no room for you to have more. So you think about how he reacts when you get taught a transaction and he doesn't get taught a transaction, right? Because for a lot of black people, that's it. That's the marker, right? The marker is so much of our success is dependent on how other people feel about us in the workspace. So if Thabo carries favor with the boss and I don't, regardless of competence, Thabo will do well and I won't. And that's what it means to just exist in the state of precarity where you're always just reliant on somebody else. So he is trashy, but I think that a lot of that trashiness is also informed by what it means to be in these environments that make us feel like we constantly have to compete with each other.
So are you saying, let me ask this question then. Are you saying he's effectively just a product of his environment because he comes from an environment that is not plentiful with everything?
Not just a product of his environment. I think it's an interaction of many things. I think that the environment enables the trashy behavior. He is baseline trashy, but he also comes from the kind of environment that may have molded that trashiness. Because a lot of us growing up will hear that, like, you can't waste this opportunity. You are the only one. Don't bring people along because then you're not going to get this opportunity. They're going to give it to Thabo. So if you take Thabo along, that automatically means that you're not going to get the opportunity anymore.
And you know what it also,
yeah.
You know what it also is? I feel like Thabo in the clever, man. Thabo in the clever, I want to get out of this poverty thing. And was speed, bro? Was speed? Like, why now suddenly you want to have a degree? Why now suddenly you want to do this? So I think the other thing that I found about a person like Vincent is that Vincent was once saying, if I can, I want to have this opportunity for myself because this is my way out of the township. And if Thabo and I both have this opportunity, in all likelihood would know that Thabo might make it out because Thabo is applying himself more. Thabo really wants this. And nah, I'm just coasting, right? Because that's the interaction that we seem to get from Vincent. Vincent is like just coasting. You know those people who are like, I'm just doing the bare minimum. I'm not going to go above the bare minimum. And Thabo and Nekio Wata.
Yeah.
I don't know, guys. I don't know. I think that
I don't know, Shokonolo, because just to come in there, he wasn't coasting. Remember, you spoke earlier about this failing forward story. If you count taking matric on my own, I did matric 3 times essentially, right? So did Vincent. So Vincent and I think, understood that our parents don't have money, right? If we are ever going to get beyond who we are now, it's going to be school, right? So I think for me, I mentioned it later in the book. There's some religious element to it as well. I won't mention the denomination, right? But Vincent and I were aware that let's go to school, get bursaries, get good marks, get bursaries, get to school, maybe get a job. That's our way out. But after the attempts to get good marks, to get a bursary, on his side, when it didn't fall the right way, right? I think he then decided, and he was susceptible to any kind of ideology that suggests that I'm told like school is not it, and so part of it I think is defense mechanisms that become available to someone, and if you fully adopt it, you actually now occupy the role of the bad guy in any situation, because for example, we have jokes these days about inyoga, right? Which I'm going to Limpopo to get a snake to progress in life, right, economically. But we know that often, if someone has succeeded, one good way of devaluing their success is to say they've used the snake, right? So I think it's that kind of thing as well that was happening on the side of Vincent. He needed something to just a defense mechanism of sorts, and it made him the bad guy in this. I know what he did was terrible, but
trashy. Look, we can complicate him as much as we want. We can give him all the benefit of the doubt. At the root of it, that person was not a friend that had your best interest at heart. That was not a friend who had your best interest at heart.
Yes, you asked me before the conversation became official whether he still is in my life, and the answer was a resounding no, because it actually, guys like that, it'll sound very much like you're making it up now, but guys like that can do something with the knowledge that they'll just, maybe even our own wanting to give them the benefit of the doubt will give them that redemption that they seek, but they can do quite terrible things.
I think that it's interesting we're talking about these guys, because the relationships with the guys in the book, and I want to talk about friendship, right? Because I think that we're having these conversations around toxic masculinity, toxic masculinity. But I think that in men's friendships, often you see the toxic masculinity. So this inability to be vulnerable, because Wilson could have said, Thabo, man, ish. Like, just show me what you're doing. Oh, these are my desires. This is what I want to know. So I want to know about your reflections around friendships, right? Now that you're older, so you wrote the book, you reflect on your life, but you've also had some life experiences. And I mean, like I said, Machita in this book didn't do well, But but I want to know, I'm always curious about men's friendships, because I think there's so much there for analysis, but also for reflection.
Look, you're probably right. I mean, the men in that book, maybe with the exception of my dad, my uncle was like an asshole, to use a term. And then there was my brother, who was a wonderful guy in the sense that he introduced me to, reading, to American politics, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, guys like those. Then my parents, my dad. But outside the home, I think, look, in those youthful years, I have to be honest. I think in a chapter, I described that wherever I went, right, there seemed to be an idea that actually, what the heck is he doing? You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's a scene I describe in a taxi where one of my brother's friends is flabbergasted that you spent 3,600 on books, right? Obviously, with incidents like that, there will come a time when you're not maybe engaging as much, or you're not exposing yourself as much to experiences with other men, right, or other young men, because they're always going to have a view that is not like, I don't need this right now. Thank you very much. Maybe later, or something like that. So men are actually competitive. Let's not lie about this, especially in those types of years between 20 and 25, when you're just becoming a man. You've asked Lutawano why Rorisang is not being spoken of maybe more in the book. She was actually a source of too much trouble in a way, because if you have a pretty girl for a girlfriend, it's another layer of, at least for me, you have to feel the other types of like toxic masculinity, as she's put it, Yeah, so I think in my youth, there is a friend, though. We've said that the male weren't doing well, but we speak of Doma, who's very, I don't think actually, remember now, doing a degree by correspondence or distance learning, as they called it, and getting good marks, I don't think it would have been possible had there not been someone who actually is sort of leaning towards this idea of intellectual engagement and is not uncomfortable with the idea of school and ideas, So there were good people. I think there were sort of good males in that regard.
I think only Duma. Let's just be honest. Only
Yeah.
Duma. Let's not say there were good males, so it's only Duma. Duma was the only one who had your back. I mean, another incident that I wanted to talk about is, wait, King, Thabo, you've gone through a lot, man.
I actually think for me, it's like, you know what? If we do a survey, sorry guys, I've had it good. Actually, when I started writing, I did come to the conclusion that this could only happen to a black guy. All these little microaggressions and other things. But if you want to talk about hardship, like real suffering, guys, I'm not applying for that role. I think it belongs to someone else. Even though I did have hiccups and those hitches here and there. Yeah, please continue.
Unrelated, before you even go further, I think that because we were talking about so many sad moments now, but just the dedication in the beginning of the book made me want to convince my husband to write her story. So even me, I can have a book dedicated to me, right? So
hey, Mbali.
Hey, guys, just that line. I was like, I actually need to tell my husband so that he writes a book, and he must writing the book. So those are some sweet moments. I think that I think Thabo's right. We've reflected a lot on the tough moments, right? But I think that there is a danger when you're black, right, to reflect a lot on the sadness and the difficulty, but not on the joy. And I mean, for me, your teacher, who you also write about in the book, and the ways in which she just persisted, even when you were really just being a problem child, when you were just being Now, what's fair is such an important part of the book for me, because I think in a lot of ways, when you think of our schools and we think of the ways in which our teachers who are under-resourced and go through so much, how they navigate those students who may not be like, your typical A students. It can be a little bit disappointing, but here was this woman who soldiered on and who persevered with you. And for me, that was a really sweet moment in the book, because it also speaks to the power of teachers and the power that teachers have to mold our children's futures.
Yeah, you've said it there, because that teacher subsequently became, you remember that lady, the sergeant in arms in Parliament? That's actually her, Mrs. Kidiboni Mushomi, or she's known as Regina Mushomi now.
Oh.
She actually, this writing thing, she actually mentioned it in some time in high school, that, because I think I had written a long essay there, filling up pages, and she actually said, you should consider writing, because I'd been reading about this guy who writes James Bond's things, Ian Fleming. So that teacher, when the hormones of teenage years were actually really doing their thing, I wasn't going to school. She came to my mother's house there and sorted me out. So I think, look, she was a second mother in a manner of speaking. Yeah, the teenage years for me could have been almost like the full stop for me, right? But she managed to work some magic.
And what won't Black women do, though? Like what won't Black women do, right? Especially when they can see potential. So we're grateful for all the Black women who continue to show up, and also for the educators. I think I like the fact that you are honoring her now and just speaking about like how sort of the trajectory of your life changed because of someone who took an interest in you and saw the potential and wanted to hone the potential, especially in the environments that we often come from, where we often think about like other teachers who teach locationing, their children often go to like Model C school, so they don't care about like everybody else. But there are really teachers who are genuinely concerned about the well-being of their students, and shout out to her. Thabo, you can hear that we had a wonderful time reading your book. Obviously, we can talk and talk and talk and talk, but we want to give people an opportunity, if they have any comments, any questions, to just do that before we go off. I'll just read one of them. So someone on Twitter, Mohau, says, just arrived home and taking some rest, and what better way to do so than listen to inspiring stories from authentic Africans who aspire to be the best they can despite their backgrounds. Cheeky Natives, my hub for African intellectualism and discovery.
Wow. And
then Mto on YouTube was like people, and I like the play on Black people, like people, and the scarcity mentality. Great point, Dr. Alma. And then Wandile said, I like how Dr. Alma complicates Vincent. Interesting, that view. Hey, wamu humanizer, Vincent, wamu humanize. So if anyone has any questions, please post the questions and we'll ask them. So let's just give it a minute or two. But Thabo, from us, the Cheeky Natives, this was really such like a interesting book to read, because as I said, I thought I was gonna get hardship and like da 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 da, and there were moments where I was infuriated, but I also enjoyed the writing. Like I really enjoyed the writing. The writing was so engaging. It was so nice, and also I enjoyed like how there are moments where you didn't take yourself seriously in the book, where you're just like, I really enjoyed that. So I suppose, what's next for you? So this is your first book. Obviously, you've left us hanging at 24. We want more. So what is next?
I'm actually not entirely sure. There is writing that I have done. It's quite bulky and significant already, almost sizable enough to make a book out of. But the subject matter is I think, very challenging, in the sense that I'm talking about being Black now, but slicing it up, almost making full chapters out of one specific area. Let's say, for example, ethnicity, right? Being Zulu, being Sotho, and the dynamics around that. I mean, you know now that I had a lady protesting on 702 that the Zulu should not be called a nation because that suggests, that they can be on their own, like not part of South Africa. Whilst maybe Sotos and what about Tsongas, and are they also a nation or are they a tribe? But the Zulu are a nation. So it's those sort of topics that I'm sort of contemplating publishing, but time will tell, I suppose, because I think when you enter into the space of politics and ethnicity and some of these things, I do not know. I do not know whether I'm the guy, whether my skin is thick enough, to withstand what may then come back from the environment. Yeah. So that's what could be next for me.
What's the reception to the book like? I mean, for me, I think that memoirs are incredibly personal, but it also involves putting so much of your own vulnerability for display. And so I want to know what the reception has been like, particularly because you wrote about your family, you wrote about people who know you and that you've interacted with quite closely.
Yes, one of the first copies went to my brother, and I told him that, look, you see in the chapter, The Road Not Taken, I say a few things that I think you did go a bit wayward there. So it's a very mature guy. Said, look, Thabo, at the end of the day, we could say it's only your opinion. So he was very, he handled it quite well. Mr. Van Aert, Dr. Van Aert, also reviewed the book, and he felt, look, I think you're actually just touching the surface when you're describing dynamics within his family. And obviously there's Mbali, my wife there. She mentioned to my wife and best friend, she's been, she's saying, what are we doing next? And friends, obviously, from work and, the more immediate ones. So the responses have been good. But I think time will tell. It's my first book, and I was simply trying to share, right? And in the hope, obviously, that it does touch someone, it does teach where possible. Yeah. So, and thank you very much, guys, for hosting me. This is one of my first, probably, these types of conversations, and I'm hoping that you will continue to do the good work that you do for Africans in general, and me and people like myself.
So I just want to say Sabawela to be like, and to my partner and best friend, because did you say the eyes lighting up, and obviously my wife and best friend Mbali.
So, I mean, this has just inspired me because my husband's doing his master's and he has to write his dissertation. So now I'm going to make sure I always bring him his favorite thing he's writing. I'm going to make sure I get the first line in the dissertation. I'm inspired now. I'm going to make sure that I bring him his favorite biscuits. Guys, stay tuned. I think that this dedication has just made me woke.
Right. So there's a question from Wandile on YouTube. How do you feel now that you've written the book? Do you feel like you've left something out, or like you like what you have done? Or you like what you have done?
Those things that you might call or you might say have been left out are actually things that I probably feel aren't really shedding any light on Black life. They are commonplace. Everyone knows about those. Yeah, so, but I do feel, in a way, because the book was brought about by a traumatic event to a degree. Had I not had that little tiff with the people at work, I would not have started reflecting about what my life has meant, right? So I'm happy that I got that opportunity, even if it arose from somewhat unpleasant sort of incidents.
Thabo, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation with us here at the Cheeky Natives. I think for everyone who's watching and who will watch later, both Alma and myself recommend Native Boy Confessions of a Maplazini in the City, because I think what it does is that it sort of shines a different light on conversations that we have about racism and race relations in South Africa. And it also speaks to, and I hate using this word, but like, how people persevere in order to achieve their dreams, right? That if the system may be against you, but in some ways we carve out space and ways in which we can make things work for us. And also like just, reading about our lives, the ordinary, and how like the ordinary like is filled with lessons. So thank you so much from the Chickenators for writing this book, and we wish you the very best for all of your endeavors.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much, everybody. This has been such a delightful conversation. And we do hope that you guys are going to go out and support this book and get the book from various retailers. But also there's something to be said about seeing our stories in print and seeing ourselves added to the archive and writing against the silence. And so I really want to just congratulate Thabo again for writing a book that is light but packs such a heavy punch, as the Tlokonolo's alluded to. So thank you so much once again. Congratulations, Thabo, on your first book. May this be the first of many. But also thank you so much to everybody who joined us for this conversation. And we are really looking forward to seeing many more conversations around this book, but also just around Black lives and what it means to be Black in this country at various points, right?
Indeed.
And if you want a copy of Native Boy, please send us an email at info@cheekynatives.co.za, and then we will be able to get you copies through the Cheeky Merchant.
All right. Thank you, guys. Let me just do the same as well, guys. Support.
Yes, one more time. Here it is. Native Boy.
Get the book.
Get the book. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.